notepads, get ready. Thank you, Jay, for joining us.
Well, thank you very much. And the reason I was late today was it took a long time to find business clothes after the first time in 15 months. It was not my wife's fault.
It was.
So I actually live here just south of here in Boynton Beach, and I'm a Canadian living in Florida, so it's kind of like living on vacation. I had to hang up my hockey skates during the pandemic, and so I got on my road bike and just started riding up and down the ocean here on A1A. And as an analyst, of course, I built a spreadsheet and started tracking my heart rate and all the other stuff, but I started logging these 50-mile rides to the point where I made it to Toronto. So I said, hey, that's cool. And then, you know, my dad lives in Calgary. What if I just keep riding? I'm like Forrest Gump, I just kept going. And now I made it to Calgary on Father's Day, and now my mom lives north of Vancouver, so I'm kind of going that way, and I thought, why stop there? I'll just come down to California, around to Texas, and just kind of loop North America as my COVID-inspired journey. So thank you so much for having me. I sit at kind of this intersection, which is somewhat blocked, of world trade that flows indirectly. So if you look at the $86 trillion around the world in every industry that changes hands, 75% of it goes through other people. You bought your last car from a dealer, you bought your last TV from a retailer, you bought your last jar of peanut butter from a grocer. Most of us have to think where the last thing we bought direct. You could have bought a computer from Dell, you could have maybe got your car insurance from Geico, but you have to think a moment in your personal and professional life. You're always dealing with agents and dealers and resellers and retailers and franchisees and other types of distributors and wholesalers in our life. So in the tech industry, it's actually 64%. And I made a prediction before the pandemic, a few years ago, that this number had now plateaued over 40 years and is going to start to come down. What I didn't predict is the pandemic and how fast it is coming down as customers are changing, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So I started to think about today's talk, and I wanted to serve up probably the most disruptive and the biggest opportunities for all of us in this room going forward. But if you look at the customer and look at the ways they're looking at purchasing things, and I focus most of my time in business to business. I'm not out there thinking about peanut butter all that often. But if I look at the 175,000 software companies today, by the way, there's 10,000 software companies 10 years ago. 10 years from now, there's going to be 1 million software companies. You may have read about software eating the world and every company becoming a tech company. Most of them are thinking about product-led growth. The success about a year ago, we first heard about Zoom. And Zoom was a completely free platform with full functionality up until the point at 40 minutes where it was going to hang up on our customer. We all rifled into our pocket quickly and typed in our credit card number so it wouldn't hang up. We may have used Slack, and it's great tool, full functionality, until it threatens to take away the history, which is kind of the value of collaboration, is seeing backwards. We may have used Dropbox until you wanted to send a bigger file or store some other thing. So this product-led growth model is every company thinking right now. Tens of thousands of companies are growing up in a product-led growth model, which doesn't require resell. The product itself is the sales and marketing for the company. We're seeing an explosion of direct-to-consumer. So we started to think about consumption differently. And this is technology driving a lot of this, but your printer, the ink, as it gets lower, each of those manufacturers now call home and ship you new ink. So it's a set it and forget it type of technology. It's consumption. The paper that goes into your printer sits on an Internet of Things weigh scale in the closet or in your business, and when it gets down to 5 pounds, it triggers an order. You set it up once if you want that order to come from Office Depot here in Florida, if you want it to come from Amazon, if you want it to come from Larry in the white van, wherever you want, but you set it and forget it. The point is, kind of like peanut butter, I make a choice, and I kind of want to forget about it for the rest of my life, but I never want to walk into my pantry and be out of peanut butter. And I never want my printer to be out of paper. But you start thinking through every one of the 250 categories inside the tech industry, A lot of it is consumption-based. Set it and forget it. I don't need to shop and make a brand selection every week. I just want to forget about that part of my life and never think about it again. Subscription and consumption models, which we're going to go into, but 76% of CEOs today in every industry think their current business model will be unrecognizable in 5 years. 76%. They're serving customers differently. Everything you buy today, from your toothbrush on up, that company is thinking about charging you per month. Where your Dollar Shave Club or whatever it is, but in that subscription or consumption model, it completely changes everything. And we'll talk about big companies in the tech industry that are completely changing, including my wife, who now works at Cisco as of yesterday, to drive this model into the industry. We look at usage-based, value-based pricing, completely different. As we're looking at expense management, as we're looking at managing and monitoring all this, how do you start to predict and manage and monitor and measure consumption models? How do you predict and prescribe what that's going to be? You don't buy $1 million worth of stuff and use it till it breaks. You consume it. And that's a different model, and that puts pressure on us to figure out how to go do that at scale. And then marketplaces grew more in 3 months in the early pandemic than the last 10 years combined. The future buyer looks a lot like a consumer. And these marketplaces, which we're going to go into, are creating a lot of change in terms of what we do every day and the influence we have on the market. But suffice it to say, every company in every industry is becoming a tech company. They're coming into our world. Every professional services firm in every industry is now a tech services company. Digital agencies, there's 200,000 of them. 78% of marketing agencies are now tech services companies, servicing the 8,000 MarTech technology companies. Accountants, 300,000 accounting and CPA firms around the world. 81% of them are now doing tech services. You will go up, my last speech before the pandemic was at Sage in Orlando with thousands of accountants in the audience. Dynamics, NetSuite, Intuit, these are tech services companies. Why? Because accounting itself, tax, audit, is a commodity business. Tech service is a 75% margin. For agencies, creative and concierge and all that advertising, it's a commodity business. 17% margins. Well, if I go do integrations and implementations, that's 75. Every company is stepping in to the tech industry. So from a GDP perspective, the tech industry is going to go from 5% to 10 this decade. It's doubling. Where the other 90% of GDP are companies that are becoming tech companies too. So the tech industry is not an industry vertical anymore, it's a horizontal. The other thing is the question of why. You know, we've always talked about specialization in our industry. You know, we got to become more verticalized. We got to get smarter about healthcare. Well, verticalization is done. It's vectorization now. So if we monitor these 175,000 software companies, or if I monitor the 800,000 emerging tech companies, IoT, AI, automation, blockchain, quantum, VR, AR, MR, self-driving cars, drones, we can talk about any future technology. It lays up on 5 vectors. You are serving a buyer. So the line of business now makes 65% of software decisions. So if you're a SaaS company, you're probably not calling on the CIO or CTO or CISO. You're calling on the head of marketing. Guess what? In many companies now, the head of marketing spends more money on technology than the head of technology. Why are digital agencies, 78% of them, really focused on this? Well, because they've got a big buyer. And they've known this buyer for over 100 years. So line of business is key when 65% of the tech industry is going there and growing. Second is sub-industries. You know, your knowledge about healthcare and HIPAA and high tech is great, but the way you service a 50-doctor clinic is different than a dentist office. It's different than a small hospital, a large hospital. There's 12 sub-industries inside healthcare. They all have different opportunities. And you can't call on you can't build software, you can't build hardware, you can't go into that conversation in a mid-sized clinic the same way you would with your PowerPoint slides for a large hospital. So looking at the sub-industries across the 27 major industries is critical in understanding this future. Sector size and segment, the 50 doctors obviously. The categories. I worked for IBM for 17 years and Lenovo. You know, it was simple back then when it used to be hardware, software, and services. Well, today we manage 26 major categories of tech and with 250 subcategories. So you can't have a security conversation today without talking about the 7 layers of security and then the 17 layers below that. So if I were to multiply all those together, which I did, there's 35 million conversations going on every day. Why is there going to be 1 million software companies from the 175,000 we have today? Because there's 35 million places you can go build software. I'm not going to go build software to take on Microsoft or Oracle. I'm going to go build software to solve for that mid-sized clinic in upstate New York. And I'm going to go win 80% share of 100 clinics up there. Very profitably, and I'll grow from there. So where we are in the pandemic, at Forrester we survey 690,000 people per year. So we get a lot of interesting feedback in terms of where people are spending money, and we get to watch the industry behind it. Right now, far and away, automation is the #1 place companies are spending money. In the session we just had about sharing stories about the pandemic, the most interesting thing to me was how many companies went from survival mode to thrive within days of the pandemic. I was expecting a 2008 or a 2001. I was expecting a long drawn out, black swan event where if you weren't in hospitality or tourism, travel, if you weren't in specific areas of the market, you were back into putting your foot on the gas. So for the first time in over 100 years, the pandemic was a human-based failure for companies. Everybody went home. Every process, every workflow, every piece of business logic that revolved around the office broke down. So companies in RPA, robotic process automation, grew by triple digits. A company like UiPath went public and they're posting 83% growth year over year. The SaaS companies that have no-code and low-code environments, for example, lightning bolts or lightning flows on top of Salesforce, are exploding as letting companies move humans from being gates inside processes to becoming parallel to processes. You've seen the absolute explosion in cloud growth. So a company like Microsoft posted Azure growth, 50, 50, 48, and 47% growth in the 4 quarters inside the pandemic. Google Cloud's at 46. The guy who runs AWS got a nice promotion to take over from Jeff Bezos. This is absolutely incredible growth. On the SaaS side of things, the Salesforce, the ServiceNow, the Workday, the NetSuite, the Marketos, all the way down the list are in the 30% growth. So huge growth numbers inside a pandemic around software. The third thing is this new remote topology. Everyone went home, but the future of work says that upwards of 20 to 30% of people now think about work as what you do, not where you go. And every company's different, but we know that 20 to 30% of people will never return to the cubicle the way they were before. And so this presents all kinds of opportunities and challenges in terms of spending money to make that remote or residential style network work. And then finally, when I talked about moving from survival to thrive, it all became about the customer. Every single industry had to rethink their customer experience. Think of curbside service times 27 industries. So the amount of money spent on customer experience, last year was also a really tough year beyond the pandemic. If it was in the US, there was some political and social unrest, there were murder hornets. It was a year of employee challenges as well. Employee experience, partner experience, customer experience became the areas of investment. Projects that were underway were accelerated. we talked about, 18 months of transformation, which was greater than the last 10 years combined. In e-commerce and marketplaces, which we're going to talk about. So I want to end today kind of walking through, I think, the most disruptive things to all of us in this association. And I would challenge you that we all have to raise our voice. We're actually experts in many of these future trends. And as part of this association, as part of the community, as part of our companies, as well as our industry, our sub-industries that we're in, we have to kind of raise our voices and give our perspective and our leadership around some of these big, big changes. And the first thing I always start with is the customer. One is your future customer in 4 to 5 years will be a majority millennial. We're going through that demographic shift now. But on top of a demographic shift, we're going through a major behavioral, psychology, and a difference of the buying journey itself. Everything is changing to digital or digital only. The amount of people that don't want to talk to a salesperson increases every single year. It's now more than half. The amount of people that want to go through an entire digital journey, make vendor selection and purchase without ever filling out a marketing form with the correct information is now well over 50%. And now, for the first time, 51% of buyers are getting to vendor selection by being anonymous. And we're starting to dig into what that means. I mentioned 2/3 of these buyers, in terms of cloud. But if you focus on this early digital journey, what does it mean? There are, on average, 5 different people or companies that highly influence the buyer. So the last time you bought a car, you probably engaged in your own digital journey. You've read magazines, you've watched YouTube videos, you talked to your neighbor, you went on social media. There's 365 kinds of cars. You're not going to go visit 365 dealerships. It's painful enough visiting one. So what you do is you kind of narrow it down, and narrow, and narrow, and narrow, and you might get to your own short list of 2 or 3, but if I asked you the questions, every click, every question, every day, how did you get to that short list? You would probably start naming names of places that helped you with information and things like that. So in the business-to-business world, there was something that rocked this a couple of weeks ago. Google and Apple both found privacy religion at the same time. All of our iPhones were updated 3 weeks ago. So when you go to an app, it now asks you, do you want to be tracked? Can anybody guess how many people want to be tracked? After 3 weeks and hundreds of millions of people answering, it's 4. 4% of people have said yes. 96% said no. Your customer who wants to be anonymous is now anonymous. Apple and Google combined own 99% mobile share around the world and 86% browser share. Your access to the internet, laptop, desktop, mobile, however you access the internet, is probably through one of these 2 companies. Their ability to remove cookies, targeting, and other tracing technologies changes the game. The only way you're going to get access to those early customer moments is not through the MarTech stack or the AdTech stack we've had for the last decade. It is through those partners, the 5 of them, that sit at this virtual table. If none of those 5 people are partners of yours, there's a risk that they're partners of your competition, and there's a risk that that customer is going to get to vendor selection, and you're going to lose a deal without ever knowing there was a deal. This is the decade of the ecosystem, and this is exactly why. What worked in the past, people hoovering and transforming all of our personal privacy data to understand what kind of car we wanted, is all gone now. We can be as anonymous as we want to be. So, a little hard to see, but it's meant to be hard to see. How do you predict who those 5 people in the room are going to be? In a technology decision, this is more celestial than it's ever been. We don't buy from a VAR, a reseller, through a distributor. It's not linear anymore. When you bought a car, I can kind of look at the sky and think car and driver and road and track, and I can, Edmunds, and I can try to figure out who's going to be closest to you. But I got to start to look at my channel in a less transactional way and in a more ecosystem way, a non-transactional way. And I need my channel to be there in those early moments. If I get one person in that room out of 5, if I get 2, if I get 3, my chances of getting mentioned early and often and becoming part of that vendor selection improve exponentially. The world is becoming ecosystem-based. So as an analyst, we can put this into a model and put a complicated word like trifurcating in front of it. But it's simple if you actually look at the customer journey and overlay your partners. For 40 years, we put every effort behind the transactional channel. People have built gold, silver, bronze programs. They've built all kinds of incentives and revenue reduction and gross to nets and all wonderful things in the middle. Well, in a subscription consumption world where 76% of companies are thinking about, the transaction is the first 30 days with the customer. While it's important, it becomes more important to get to the dance in this new anonymous, digital-only way. And then it becomes really important once you get that first 30 days to drive adoption of your product, to drive stickiness and integration, to drive upsell and cross-sell, to drive enrichment. There's a bunch of things that now come. If you buy Netflix for 12 bucks, the first thing is you don't buy Netflix from your cable guy in the white van. It's a digital subscription. The second thing is if you go a month or 2 and don't watch Netflix, you're going to be staring at your credit card going, I might cancel this. It's a different model, so every company is getting obsessed with this retention channel. The interesting thing is the influence channel and the retention channel are non-transacting partners. There's no program. There's no gold level of being a non-transacting partner. But they're critically important. And companies are going to have to rethink everything they do indirectly around who is participating, around what 5 seats, at what time, driving what value for our company. It changes everything. So some real world stats. Microsoft, who runs the biggest channel organization in any industry with 355,000 active partners today, is actually bringing on 7,500 new partners every single month. 80% of them are non-transacting. They sit on influence, they sit on retention, but they're not the CSP, LSP program of the past. Their new channel chief at Microsoft isn't a channel chief that you would expect in a gold, silver, bronze. It's somebody that came out of IoT, mobility, and other places and understands ecosystems more than just incenting people to sell more. AWS keeps doubling their channel every year. They're bringing on 3,000 partners a month. But 85 to 90% of them are non-transacting partners, but critical to getting AWS as the leader in their market. Salesforce is interesting. I'm going to come back to them later because it's a really interesting story. But they announced they want to grow from $25 to $50 billion. And they did a bunch of work with us at Forrester, and they actually quantified it that it's going to take 250,000 partners to do that. How do they get in the room of the sales cloud, the marketing cloud, the customer success cloud, the revenue cloud, the loyalty cloud? How do they get in front of that many buyers? How do they get to the dance? How do they get people to integrate it well so that they never unplug it? It's 250,000 new partners they need. The same day they announced this, they shut down the resell program. They don't have a trifurcated model, they have a bifurcated model. Every dollar is going to flow through the app exchange. Hold on that one for a second. So why and how did Salesforce do this? They were the earliest company to publish what I call a multiplier. The number was $4.65. For every dollar of Salesforce sold, the ecosystem can earn $4.65. What's interesting, I always thought this was ego with Mark Benioff when he kicks off Dreamforce, because he never wanted to talk about, like, he was always competing with Oracle. He never wanted to talk about being a small revenue company. He always multiplied it by 5 to talk like about a $300 billion ecosystem to make it sound big. Well, this multiplier is really interesting because they publish it in detail. If you want to go grab that multiplier, which by the way will be $5.80 5 years from now, here are the exact slices of the pie where you can go make money in their ecosystem. You're a digital agency? Perfect. You can go make money over here. You're a managed service provider? Here's where you can make your money. You're Accenture, Deloitte, Global System Integrator? Perfect. Here's where you can make a nickel. You're a ISV? That's awesome. We sell 6 ISVs for every 1 license we sell of Salesforce. There's another $1 in that $4.65 just for you. By the way, that entire 5-time multiplier comes at 75% margins. Everybody's flooding in. So that's where they find the 250,000 partners who don't want to be resellers. Do you want to spend a minute thinking about 20% margins and going to chase down the customer to get that money and all the net 90s and everything? No. You want to spend that minute thinking about 75% margins. I don't want to make 20% of the deal. I want to make 200 or 300% of the deal at 75% margins. Completely different frame of thinking. Every day there's a new company now coming out with this multiplier idea. Even a company like HubSpot is $5.80. And they're laying it out in detail for everybody to take advantage. I mentioned Salesforce, a $1.2 trillion new business. Google Cloud is $5.32. You can go in right to the detail level of see how you can be successful in their ecosystem. Microsoft came out in the press, actually looked like this, a few weeks ago, and the CEO had a 23-minute long article about the future of channel. And I think this is mandatory reading if you haven't read this one. And in that, he talked about a 9-time multiplier, which again is a Forrester number, but only one of their products. It's somewhere between 5 and 9. But if you see the title, Unlocking Trillions of Dollars, not a nickel of that will go into a program. It's not a volume rebate, it's not an incentive, it's not a market development fund, it's not a new customer bonus. None of that is in the middle of that chart. It is all around unlocking the value. So every company in every industry is now starting to think about this multiplier. Let's design and quantify what our ecosystem is and help everyone in the room go and be successful. If all boats rise and the customer's boat, everybody's boats rise, that's the definition of ecosystem. So I put out a 5-minute video a while back where I predicted the next $1 trillion company. And there's a lot of competition. And you understand today that it's Apple, it's Google, it's Microsoft, it's Facebook, it's Amazon. There's $5 trillion companies today in tech. So who's going to be the 6th? Is it going to be Dell? Is it going to be Cisco? Is it going to be IBM? Who's going to be that next company? Well, I think it's going to be Salesforce. And I kind of built out a quick reason why. And I've explained a little bit of it already. One, 20 years ago, they jumped on the decade of sales tech. Out of 350 CRM companies, they jumped out to the lead and they started winning 73% of every new CRM deal back then. And why? Because they sell a bag of sugar and a bag of flour, infinitely customizable, which produces a lot of value to the ecosystem who are doing that baking. 2, they became the most predictable company in the history of our planet. They've grown 20 to 30% every quarter for 20 years. No other company in the history of our stock market has done that. They, through hook or by crook, through M&A or organic or both, being a predictable subscription-based company, they can manufacture their earnings to show a 30% growth on a linear line for 20 years. There's no peaks and valleys in this performance. The multiplier, the $4.65 comes up later. The growth target, they've been very forthright within how they're growing as a company. So we talked about the 250,000 new partners. Today they're at $25 billion. By the way, they kicked off, which I think I say next. They kicked off this and they've always been quantified. We're going to grow to this by this date, and then they make it. And they're at 25 billion today, they're going to grow to 50. And I don't think there's anyone that thinks they're not going to make that number. This quarter, they're going to overtake SAP in revenue. In a year or two, they're going to overtake Oracle. They are the biggest enterprise, pure enterprise software company today. So the other thing, the other leg of the stool here is the marketplace. So at Forrester, we publish research called a wave, where we just do a bake-off. We take the 15 top things in an industry and put them through the ringer, 100 different feature function. Salesforce actually beat Amazon and Alibaba in marketplace technology. The App Exchange is the best marketplace on the planet by an order of magnitude. They put real money behind building this thing out as the marketplace of the future. And others are trying to catch them in the industry. So during this phase, you'll notice during the pandemic that they kicked a small oil company, ExxonMobil, off the Dow 30. A small little sales tech SaaS company is now part of the Dow 30 that's watched every day around the world. I mentioned, their revenue growth. So this ecosystem and becoming this $50 billion company becomes really interesting as you get into the $1 trillion conversation. And here's how the math works. It's taxation. If you wonder why Apple and Google and every one of them right now is in court for antitrust, it's taxation. They're unfair in what they're taxing Apple with Epic Games, Apple with charging the New York Times 40% to get on the News Plus. These subscriptions are very sticky, and this is going to play itself out in the next 10 years. But from a Salesforce perspective, today they tax only $1 of that $4.65, or what will be $5.80, which is software. I was a CEO of a software company for 7 years before Forrester. I was happy to pay the 15%. It was my lowest cost to acquire a customer. But today they make the dollar of their own product, and they charge 15% for the next dollar of the ecosystem. The math goes like this. When they can actually take 15% of everything, instead of charging the customer $1 plus $1, they're going to start charging the customer $6. And they'll be the one that dole out money to Accenture, the managed service provider, the digital agency, and these 16 other people that take advantage of the ecosystem. They're going to be the source of financial transaction. And they're going to actually tax everything at 15%. They haven't announced this. This is speculation on my behalf. But I can't see any other way in terms of how they become successful. Those $5 trillion companies are successful because they tax their ecosystems. And most of their ecosystems are pretty happy about it, as long as that taxation is somewhat in range. So if you do the math, and in 5 years they tax their ecosystem, that extra multiplier, they almost double the size of their company. It's a $93 billion company 5 years from now, which when you multiply by 10, which the stock market gives you as a subscription business, is a $1 trillion company. Mark Benioff, this is all he thinks about every day, I believe. And HubSpot, which is now a $25 billion company, just published the $5.80, just hired the creator of that MarTech stack, Scott Brinker, 8,000 logos, and they're going in to become that platform for marketing. They may not be thinking about $1 trillion right now, but HubSpot is thinking about hundreds of billions of dollars of valuation just based on these simple rules, 3 of them. It's the subscription, it's the platform, it's the marketplace, and partners, and taxation. You bring those 3 things together, you start to talk about a different valuation, like adding zeros to your company's valuation from a Wall Street perspective. All right, let's go back to this, because every company in every industry is going through changes, but it's changes that are different in the past. It's not product, it's not price, it's not place, it's not promotion. It is literally how they serve customers. The business model itself. And very few companies have gone through business model transformation successfully. So let's jump out of the industry for a minute and then jump back in, because every company is becoming a tech company. So forklift manufacturer in Europe, 300 dealerships, success at renting forklifts and selling forklifts, added an Internet of Things device to each forklift. So this forklift now sends out 1,000 data points per second. The humidity, the temperature, the GPS coordinates, how much it's lifting, all this wonderful data gets sent into the ether. Construction companies, builders, architects, everybody in this ecosystem around construction, all of a sudden is getting this data that they don't know what to do with. Interesting. What's more interesting is you go to their website, it looks more like a Microsoft or AWS website now. Digital solutions by this forklift. You're in here looking for how big the tires are, how much it lifts, what the thickness of the steel. They don't tell you any of that anymore. They're talking about these 1,000 data points, and they're talking about building bigger, better, faster, cheaper buildings. Outcome. Okay, so you click one more time trying to get some specs, and I just lost my clicker. All right, so you click the next click on the website. This forklift is now the digital central ecosystem for everything. And you start reading these words along the bottom, fleet management, it sounds a lot like us. It sounds a lot like Accenture. It sounds a lot like a company that's trying to become a platform. It sounds like a company that's trying to be the Tesla of forklifts. This is the future, and this is a forklift company. So in the world of an ecosystem, this is how they're changing their model. Yeah, the 300 dealerships need what they need, and we need to enable them. We need to run programs and incentive. We need to do what we do in the transactional model. But in this trifurcated model, we need to drive value creation. 1 + 1 = 3. Do you know how many software companies are going to be invented over the next decade to take advantage of those 1,000 data points and build bigger, faster, better buildings? The co-innovation is off the charts in terms of the next generation of Internet of Things, the next generation of automation, self-driving forklifts, AI, drones, everything inside this ecosystem. And then the network effects. This is interesting because they're partnered with Microsoft and AWS and Google and everybody else, Oracle, SAP, IBM. They're bringing them further into the construction industry than they've ever been. The network effects on the one side is great, but on the other side, these other companies are bringing this forklift manufacturer into tech. And all of a sudden, all of us start getting interested in forklifts. And there are millions of companies that are starting to talk about construction tech, and somebody building out a tech stack as we speak. So in this world of change, the subscription consumption models, inside the pandemic, we had made this prediction before the pandemic, but guess what? Everything accelerates due to the pandemic. So, a company that I worked for 17 years jettisoned the services group that they built during the 1990s while I was there. IBM now is a 100% subscription consumption company, multi-cloud, hybrid cloud, and AI. They bought Red Hat, that's the way they're going. You missed that one? Michael Dell took all of $94 billion in 7 divisions, VMware and EMC and everything, all in as a service, accelerated because of the pandemic. Dell Apex, if you've been watching that in the last few weeks, is all around this future where you can't buy a Dell product anymore. You subscribe to Dell products. You missed that one, and you missed my wife's introduction. Chuck Robbins announced this at Cisco. Everything at Cisco will be as a service. You know, today, a lot of their products are in the 60 to 70% range. You start getting into networking, you start getting into the raw hardware that runs, you know, the plumbing behind the internet. It's a ridiculously challenging, but again, forcing as a service transition. HPE's actually been on this journey the longest, and with GreenLake, and now they've announced they're going to be there in 6 months, fully as a service. If you kind of just track back the names I just gave you, IBM, HP, Dell, and Cisco, that kind of makes up about 80% of the client server era in hardware, are all in as a service. If you're a reseller, if you're anywhere in the tech industry, if you're doing any kind of expense management, if you're doing any kind of analysis as a CIO or somebody in the ecosystem, you're starting to rethink everything differently. So when every solution has layers, when I said that Salesforce will sell 6 other things on top, this forklift will now sell everything on top, the world turns into layers. There's no single solution when there's 35 million conversations. There's a group, there's an ecosystem of things, hardware, software, and services, emerging tech, to solve. So what's less interesting in talking about 800,000 emerging tech companies or 1 million software companies is we get to talk about the digital connective tissue in between the layers, the icing on the cake. Where does the money change hands? Who wins in this environment? And where, after a digital journey, does a digital transaction happen? And then the digital long-term retention. And so the study of icing, the study of the layers of the cake or the connective tissue becomes interesting. Another big change that's rocking the industry is there's no products anymore. There's no SKUs. I wrote a big piece asking if distributors are the future of distribution, which got me a lot of cease and desist letters. But when you're in a model, and I want to talk about IBM because I worked there for so long. Here's a company that for 28 straight years has won the patent race. And in those 28 years, it hasn't even been close. Like last year, Samsung was 1/3 of the patents that IBM got for second place. So a company that is sitting on a mountain of IP about the future, every one of those categories I talked about, IoT and quantum and AI and blockchain, everything, they've got IP leadership in. Well, here's a company who has dropped revenue every year for a decade and just fired their latest CEO. Well, here's a company with 450,000 people that never really figured out that any of those technologies are not products. They made a fateful mistake 10 years ago when they decided to sell all of us Watson to cure cancer. Well, 10 years later, it didn't. And the doctors at Duke and the doctors at other places started to speak out that we were oversold. AI helps, but it's not curing anything. And it's not solving world peace. It's not predicting the weather. They would have been better off 10 years ago to sell Watson to Salesforce and ServiceNow and Workday and every other SaaS and MTech company so that Salesforce didn't have to go and build Einstein. Watson would have been embedded in everything we do today. None of the salespeople at IBM, none of the distributors they use, none of the linear supply chain gets a non-product SKU world. And they had no one equipped, no skills to go and sell into an ecosystem. So I think IBM's on another 1993 journey, where when I joined the company, it almost didn't make payroll the first week I joined. I think in the next 10 years, they're facing this. The new CEO has made this billion-dollar commitment that they're actually going to get this right. 28 years of IP leadership is actually going to be embedded in the world. They're going to look more like Intel than they're going to look like, you know, a company selling you a server. That was my article. In behind that, you know, was a much deeper article. But distributors in this linear supply chain, when the transactions the first 30 days with the customer, as software eats the world, as buyers change, as an ecosystem nobody hides, the conclusion was really two things. For distributors to survive this decade, and 2 weeks after this article, Synnex and Tech Data came together. There's been all kinds of consolidation. Every single major distributor has been bought out by private equity. You know, they see the challenges ahead and they have to go private to go do the things they need to do. But they have to do two things. They have to come out of hiding. In an ecosystem of celestial stars and moons, nobody hides. If there's value add to be had, which there's a ton that distributors offer, it has to be out open and the customer needs to see it. Second, they need to become a platform for distribution. Distributing bits, software bits, is different than distributing atoms, physical products. So yes, 3PL logistics and all the capital and credit facilities, well, capital and credit melts away in a subscription model. All of the risk, all of the money, all of the flow, everything goes back to the vendor. HPE doesn't need, or Dell or Cisco, none of them need the credit facilities anymore. There's no $1 million floor financing that needs to be done. HPE is now $9,000 a month forever on that $1 million server. And if a customer can't come up with the first $9,000, you're probably not going to ship the product to them. Okay? So I actually publish a tech stack of my own, because that's what gets a lot of clicks. But I actually publish the tech stack of what makes 75% of the world go. How do you manage partners? How do you market to, through, and with them? How do you incent them? How do you manage all this data? How do you survive in the day of the ecosystem? There's now 34 companies building ecosystem tech. And so I get to look at the roadmaps, the 18-month roadmaps of every one of these companies. And by looking at their future, I can see what tens of thousands of vendors are asking them to build. And if I'm thinking trifurcated model, if you just type in channel software tech stack, you will get these charts later on. It's there. But these are the companies innovating in this space. And I would suggest for many of you, based on your introductions, these are some partnerships in your own ecosystem that you may have to start forging. Marketplaces. I'm down to my last two. Here's the McKinsey chart using Forrester data. They grew more in 3 months than the last 10 years combined. Has that plateaued? Has that leveled off? No. This is something that was coming for a long time. It took a pandemic to create the change. 1/3 of the US economy was running through marketplaces, and is today. 60% of business buyers think this is very convenient. When you go and do all that research, you know more about that car than the salesperson ever would. You go to that dealer all excited, you've got the color picked out, you know the invoice price, you know everything. You know how many cylinders and how the compression rate, you know everything. You sit down for 8 hours as they get you the deal. You already know what you're gonna pay within $100. You've done the research. And you pay $100 more for them to give you the car in your driveway and hand you the keys. I don't want the physical experience after I've gone through a digital-only journey. Customers are telling us this. This isn't just software, this is everything. I'm not gonna finish a digital journey and get into some physical sales process and get into some physical buying process. And this next decade of the ecosystem will be, a backbone of it, will be marketplaces. So of the $13 trillion of B2B that happens today around the world, we expected 17% of it to go marketplace, e-commerce, by 2023. It's now gonna happen probably by the end of this year. It's accelerating that quickly. Every single company we talk to now, when you say that 17% of your business, this becomes a back burner issues now come to the front for everyone. And so if I talk about the tech industry and where the money's changing hands, I believe that there are a couple of different kinds of marketplaces that will serve this. Broken into three. Hyper marketplaces, Amazon for business, Alibaba for business, and others. You think of consumption models, the paper, the peanut butter, the toner, you think about the consumption models, these companies are best equipped. Prime delivery, one day, at some point you're gonna trust the Amazon guy to come in your house and actually put the paper there for you. That is coming. In the middle though, the bits, this platform of distribution, I predicted 20 super winning marketplaces. So we'll take about 80% of that 17%. But we're talking $1 trillion of movement of money from resellers, VARs, managed service providers, everyone else in the tech industry, moving money from them into marketplaces. So you see the big three, AWS, Microsoft, and Google. You see the big SaaS companies, Salesforce, ServiceNow, Workday, Marketo. You see some of the legacy, Oracle, SAP, and IBM. You know, somewhere down there I've got, you know, Sage and Dell and others. So we don't have the 20 completely locked yet, but we have about 15 of them locked who are gonna win this decade. And there's embarrassments on this list, like Adele, who was the poster child for e-commerce during the 90s. I competed against that. It was brutal. They have the tech and the know-how, and they're laggards in terms of marketplace. They still think a marketplace is adding a warranty and adding a piece of plastic beside their laptop. There's no idea of long tail and how marketplace economics work and the taxation. They need to build new muscles and new skills. But on the right-hand side, there's 35 million opportunities for you to go build a marketplace. You could literally build a marketplace for mid-sized clinics with 50 doctors in upstate New York if you wanted to. It won't be successful. But if you layer back a bit, maybe mid-sized clinics across the entire United States could have a highly curated, HIPAA, high-tech compliant, tight marketplace, and you know that everything in there works together. The beacon that you buy, IoT, is HIPAA compliant. It plugs into the marketing, it plugs into the sales, it plugs into the patient system and the medical record system. So there are opportunities, and there's companies like AppDirect and Miracle and Ingram Cloud Blue. There's a company in Canada, Vendasta, that just raised $120 million last week out of private equity. There's all kinds of companies on the right here that are gonna probably implement today thousands, and soon to be, at the end of the decade, tens of thousands of specific marketplaces. Finally, future of work. So if I think of all of us in this room, most of us, when I saw the poll, are up over 20% year over year. And this pandemic created a lot of opportunity for this association, created a lot of opportunity for our businesses, it created a lot of opportunity for us personally to grow in our careers. And you never want a pandemic to, to create opportunity, but a lot of the cards that we were dealt in our favor. Last March, we drained the entire world supply chain of laptops and mobile devices, and we still haven't recovered. You know, Intel and other chip manufacturers are years out. This is why we can't buy new trucks. We all became familiar with UCaaS and dressing from the waist up and going about our lives. This was last March. But by next April, the conversation got deeper. Cybersecurity just added a complete new surface for threat vectors. Your cat's sleeping on your keyboard, your kid's getting homeschooled in the next room. 50% of security is a human-based problem. And we just added a whole bunch. You take somebody out of the cubicle where they took their employee training and you put them in a home office, all kinds of problems here and opportunity. The productivity, the efficiency, the effectiveness of this new residential network, measuring that. The compliance. Me living down in Florida, you got people like, I'd rather be quarantined under a palm tree than I would in snow. But there's all kinds of compliance issues that came with this. All kinds of continuity issues. Not only disaster recovery and backup and things like that, but how does our organization actually function? The workflows, the processes, and the business logic, disconnected from a physical location, because work is what you do, not where you go. And then finally, the governance of it all, the management of it all, the movement of money, the prediction, and the tightly ability to predict and prescribe what's going to happen. This is the future of work. This is the opportunity that we're now facing, is to have these deeper, more profitable conversations than selling laptops and free versions of Zoom. And this is where our industry is now, because there's about 20 to 30% of people that will never return in the same way. And for the next decade, we're going to be able to think about and serve customers to be able to do this much better, drive that business outcome, build a bigger, better, faster, cheaper building. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.